government, we have Durham A. And in closing opposition, we have Tel Aviv A. We are absolutely loving the energy in the room, but please can I remind you that there is a very little space between the speakers and the audience, so if you can please remain silent during the speeches and discuss anything you want to discuss in between them. The teams and the judges would be hugely appreciative. With that in mind, I warmly call upon the Prime Minister to open the case on behalf of Leiden A. Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you as a voter vote on an economic policy that is unrealistic, that is unfeasible, and that the government isn't able to be implemented, your vote is a sham. Because it was based on lies that don't represent your interest, and that politicians who weren't able to be held accountable for misinformation spread in order to create emotional appeal, but actually don't help you, but actually don't represent your interest. We think that we need an independent commission to protect voters from that type of misinformation, therefore giving them a more informed choice which truly represents their democratic wish. In this speech, I'm going to talk how we empower voters through spreading them information and how that not only benefits their democratic interest, but also make governments more effective in tackling economic policy. Before that, let's be very clear what we stand for on the opening government. So, like the status quo in the Netherlands, we'd have an independent commission that, for example, is going to be scrutinized by heavy anti-corruption measures, and it's going to approve the types of economic policy that a political party puts forward. When will a policy be approved to be used in election? When it is feasible and the government is actually able to implement it. So, for example, when the government simply doesn't have the budget to, for example, spend an enormous amount of investment into a certain sector, it is not allowed to use that as a policy platform. Or, for example, when it, for example, can't get out of a certain currency but says it wants to because of, for example, legal measures that prevent it from doing so, it isn't able to put that in a policy plan. We think, therefore, political parties are not longer allowed to use this in campaigns, but also are heavily unlikely to do so many instances, given that it's now being called out as unrealistic and unfeasible. So let's talk about how we empower voters through information. We think, yeah, go ahead.
So what is going to be the punishment if I actually continue and actually publish my plan? Who is going to sit on the committee in terms of views?
So in terms of views, it's going to be economists from a very wide school. It's not going to be neoliberals. It's also going to be people from the other side of the divide. So importantly, we think the punishment is going to be high enough to deter individuals, but we think in many circumstances that will be not necessary, because at the point where an independent commission has declared your policy is unfeasible, they're unlikely to use it in many circumstances. So, what is democracy? Democracy is a representation of your interest, and voters should be able to assess what those preferences exactly are in order to have a true democratic vote. So, information is crucial to determine your interest, because if you don't understand if a policy is feasible, or don't understand who a policy exactly affects, you don't understand if that policy actually can, for example, benefit your interest in those many instances, if it was not possible in the first place. So what is the current problem? We think for an average voter, it's very hard to understand if a particular policy which the government puts forward is feasible or unrealistic. Why? Because economic knowledge often is made up a very difficult concept. I don't even fully understand what interest rates are at this point, and I'm a person who has been to many debate competitions, right? We think those kind of difficult concepts for the ordinary voter are hard to understand because they don't come into contact with them through ordinary jobs or don't interact with them. But often, more importantly, even if you understand some concepts, the way in which economic policy works is that you do a certain thing and then a chain of events creates a certain outcome. And that chain of events is for me very hard to understand how one thing leads to another in many instances. More importantly, you don't just need economic knowledge in many instances, but you also need legal knowledge if a policy is actually able to fulfill. Let's give an actual example of this. Geert Wilders proposed in the Netherlands to switch from the euro to back to the old currency, it's called the gulden. But that's actually legally not possible, and he's not willing to, for example, take away any of the agreements which currently exist in the EU in order to make that possible in many instances. He says we can stay in the EU and also switch, but it's actually not possible given if you look at the legal sort of determination the Netherlands has made. So you don't just need economic knowledge, you also need legal knowledge in many instances. So what happens then? Many politicians simply, surprise, lie to voters in order to propose a certain policy. And they can get away with this lie because voters don't understand if they're lying or not, given that they don't have the necessary knowledge. Why do they lie? Because they want to be the politician that sounds best, that appeals to a certain set of emotions. So they, for example, say, oh, we can just pump more money into the economy and therefore the economy will run better. Even though the government maybe have a deficit, which doesn't actually make it possible in those instances to put more money in the economy. So therefore, because they appeal to the emotions of individuals of what sounds best, they don't realistically put policies forward which actually can be implemented. What are the harms of that? They're twofold. First of all, the interests of voters are not represented because when they think, oh, I vote for this politician because I think that policy actually can go through and ultimately is not able that policy goes through, then their interests are not represented in those cases. There's not a realistic option. That means it's a sham to a democracy because that policy, the fact that policy is forward in and of itself means your interests cannot be represented in many instances. But second of all, it leads to far more ineffective governments because often the politicians, even when they get into power, are going to stick to their plans. Why? Because all of a sudden when they change the economic policies, when they are in power, they will see political backlash as selling out to their core voter base, as selling out to the promises that they made earlier. So what is the problem? You're going to either wait longer with implementing a different form of policy or are unlikely to implement other policies at all because those goes against the earlier promise in terms of economic policy that you've made in those instances. Therefore, they're far more hesitant to implement any form of economic policy. What is the problem with that? Either it means that certain economic problems are simply not tackled because they're hesitant and are willing to wait. But more importantly, it decreases trust often to invest in that very economy because the government is not tackling those issues. That detracts investment, that detracts spending from individual consumers in many instances. Before I explain how we change all of those problems, second half.
Under the status quo, there is no obligation to actually follow my campaign promises when I'm in office. So you're also going to require that there is going to be a technocrat.
Look, there is not a legal obligation to follow through, but we think it's very unlikely that you will do, given that voters are going to backlash you in the fact that you are saying, oh, I said this thing in the past and I'm coming back on that promise in many instances. We think those voters are going to say, oh, all of a sudden change that policy, therefore we're no longer going to trust you in many instances. So, how do we change any of this? We force politicians to be accurate and think better in many instances if their policy is realistic, because if that's not possible, then they can't pass the test of the Commission in many instances. But more importantly, we get far more informative discourse. But currently, politicians are simply wasting time talking about, is that policy realistic or not? Is that something that actually can follow through? What we rather have is that discussion being spent on what are the actual merits of this policy. Is this a policy which will benefit the economy, or will a specific policy benefit a certain group? Currently, we waste the limited time and political discourse that we have on discussing whether that's realistic or not. When we have an independent commission which sort of takes that away and says, it is a realistic policy, now let's actually discuss the merits of that policy, we not only get far better economic policy in terms of the country, but we also far better help voters, because that discussion also helps them now better understand what the effects of that policy are, instead of having a discussion about whether or not it's realistic or not. This is this problem in this debate. Politicians are liars. We need this commission to call them out. We're very happy to propose.
I thank the speaker for their final speech, and to open the case on behalf of Leiden A, I warmly call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Three things from opening opposition today. One, on shutting the left wing out of economic policy, how we think that happens, and why them saying, well, allow neoliberals in is just not as easy to do as they might think. Two, on accountability to the people and why that's crucial. And three, on sound economic policy not necessarily being sound policy as a government. Before that, one point of extraneous rebuttal. They say to us, look, campaign lies are a problem. Obviously we agree. We think campaign lies are a bad thing. We simply think they don't change under their side of the house. Why? We think what's likely to happen tomorrow is one of the following few options. Either A, A, they dumb down their economic policy before handing it into the specialists. Why? Because when you say something like, we're going to spend more, it's pretty difficult to say that that is something that's impossible to do because it's so non-specific and nondescript. We think that's an easy way out. Secondly, they're simply going to shut out economic policy, meaning they're not going to discuss it at all. We think that's a likely scenario, given that the people generally don't understand complex economic policy, and having a complicated economic policy out on their campaign is unlikely to be politically beneficial to them. Three, we think they're just going to lie and change their mind post-election. This was hinted to you from OCG. They say to you already, CO, sorry. They say to you on OG, but look, they're disincentivized from doing that because then they get backlash from the voters. If that were true, they would have no problem in their status quo today because they couldn't tell you that they could do things that are financially unfeasible. First point on shutting out of the economic left wing. Look, we think there is a problem in that there is a streaming of specific political views within economics into economic elites. So they tell you non-neoliberal experts exist. We ask, do they? We think the way it works is, in order to advance in the worlds of economics, you only have a few select fields that you can choose to advance through. What are these fields? You can advance through banks. You can advance through the stocks exchange. At best case scenario, you can advance through financial ministries and governmental banks. Why is this problematic? On the last one, note that they are already politically inclined. Even within the politically inclined, in order to continue their job advancement in the future, they are incentivized to lean heavily towards the power structure of neoliberal finances, because that's what secures their next line job in the bank. That's what secures that they get to control the stock exchange after they're done in politics. Within the other few, note that they are streamlined within a structure that says, because we have all the money, because we have all the power, we are supportive of neoliberal economic policies because they help us maintain our power. Now, this doesn't mean none of them exist. It does mean, however, that there is a massive selection process in which almost all non-neoliberal economists get shut down and discredited at the process of attempting to gain credibility within that world. We think that means that their group of economists are going to inherently be very strongly neoliberal leaning, and we think that's a massive problem for people who are being shut out of a crucial part of the political game. Secondly, what do we think this does for accountability to the people? Before that, Theo.
I mean, academia is very is notoriously left-wing. There are many left-wing economists who can challenge false right-wing claims, for instance, about the impact of increasing minimum wage on employment levels.
So here's the thing. A, we think even within academia, economists specifically are a field in which you are given substantially more credit for being neoliberal and advance more. B, we think the incentives of the individuals don't change at the point at which they have the incentive to support these strong structures in order to advance in their field as future jobs that pay substantially more. So even this person, if this person is an academic who somehow managed to make it and is somehow considered more credible than the people at the head of the banks, he is still incentivized to at the very least hush his left-wing views down within this group in order to make sure that he doesn't piss off the banks, piss off the stock exchange, and ruin his future potential for job mobility. Secondly, on accountability to the people. We think what this does is a shift in responsibility. At the point at which a government can say it's not us, it's them. We suggested this to them. They said it's fine. They're a group of professionals, and they said we can do this and it's going to work out fine. They have a finger to point to blame at an external group. Why is this such a massive problem? Two reasons. One, we say there is a crucial necessity of economic political accountability. At the point at which you control something so crucial and basic to the individual's lives, we think it is necessary that you be able to point a specific finger not to a group, but specifically to the group that is beholden to you, whom you can replace. These groups cannot be replaced by the people. They cannot therefore be held accountable by the people. We think that's crucially a problem. Secondly, we say there's de facto spending issues that become even more problematic. So already today, we tell you governments are incentivized to spend more towards the end of their term limit in order to increase what seems like government spending and make people temporarily happy. We say this rises substantially at the point at which, if there is backlash from this overspending, it can be blamed not on themselves, but on a group of economists sitting in a room somewhere. At this point, we say, given the affinity for the people in general of the ivory tower economists, these people become a very easy culprit to point at. And we say that is massively problematic in that we say de facto, this means that spending will be worse tomorrow. Lastly, let's talk about sound economic policy. Before that, OG?
So in the first half of your speech, you actually talk about how there might be a threat of no longer discussing economic policy. Do you think the accountability towards economic policy is very big if it's at just such a great risk of being ignored and neglected?
Yes, we do. We think that means that if it's at great risk of being ignored and neglected, that is a massive problem, not a good thing. Lastly, let's talk about sound economic policy, not necessarily being sound policy. We say there are times where you spend money not to make money, but to appease people. There are times in which you spend money not because it is a right thing to do financially, but because it is a right thing to do at a leadership perspective, it is a right thing to do morally. We say, for example, when underprivileged groups in society, specific groups, are being oppressed, it is often not financially responsible to spend substantially more money on sending these groups to schools, on sending the on giving these groups extra benefits, on supporting these groups from a security perspective with additional police forces, etc. We say the fact that this is not sound economic policy does not mean it is not important policy for governments to implement. We say economists are not trained to take that into account. Even if they can, to some extent, imagine it, they are doing their job poorly if they support this as sound economic policy. At the point at which it sometimes makes sense for governments to spend more than they can afford to spend because there are simply ad hoc groups who need it so much that it's worthwhile spending on the expense of future people in order to help these disadvantaged groups right now, we say it is illegitimate to allow economists to block them from doing their job. Please oppose.
I'm going to talk about 4 things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about accountability, then about left-wing and whether they really will be put out of business if we'll look at whether their policies are feasible, then around discussions around economic policies, and lastly around the faith in politicians, where we think there's a currently collective action problem to tell the truth for politicians, which means we have the ability and the legitimacy to break that collective action problems using incentives. First of all, accountability. They tell you it's far easier to hold a political party accountable compared to this independent economic panel. What we tell you is as follows. First of all, we think that many of these people within those panels are far less needed to be held accountable, right? We think these panels are going to have lots of internal discussions, which means we think they're far less likely to make mistakes compared to political parties, especially because they already tell you how difficult people find economic policy, right? We think that when people find economic policy so difficult, they're going to vote for parties who make lots of mistakes, right? Who are very bad at with these mistakes. But secondly, we think to a great extent, currently people are not holding their political parties accountable in any way, right? We think many people are unsure how the economic policy affected what happened. We think often economic policy isn't scrutinized enough because people have different experts that they claim at random and claim for their side. We think people are unsure, therefore do not hold their political parties accountable. Moving on to the left wing and whether there will be left wing independent people. First of all, that's exactly the same argument in the last round. Didn't work there. I'm interested whether it works here. But secondly, we think there's other experts from other countries. I study economics, very left wing. They can always call me to go to one of these panels, right? We think the idea that when people study economics, all of a sudden they can become extremely right wing is simply ridiculous. We think many people engage with people at the university are very likely to be left wing. We think many people are from different countries. We think economics from the Netherlands are far more likely to be left wing than economics from the United States. We think those are things that mean there's different perceptions about economics. We don't think that's something that is necessarily true. But secondly, we think that actually it's more likely that there's going to be experts from different ideas under our side of the house because we can specifically look at people who are independent, specifically look at people who have different opinions, compared to opposition, where only the people who become experts who become spokespersons for the policies are the people who rise up through the banks, right? We think putting you in a panel means you have authority, means we can have different people on that panel with different ideas. We actually think that perhaps left-wing is going to be better represented. But if it turns out none of the people who know anything about economics know and believe in left-wing policies, it kind of hurts my left-wing heart to say it, but perhaps left-wing policies aren't necessarily feasible, right? That's something opening opposition has to explain. I know lots of people here believe left-wing policy is good, but you have to explain why. You have to explain that when it ruins the economy on the long term, when it means people in Greece are put out of business or out of their jobs, why it's so much better, right? We think often perhaps left-wing policy only looks at the short term. We actually think that's very problematic. Moving on to the discussions around economic policy. We tell you in the status quo there's not much content discussion about different economic policies. Why? Because I stand up and say my expert that I paid agrees with me, and then someone else stands up and says, well, the expert I paid agrees with me. We think that means often it's just people shouting at each other, my expert is better expert than your expert. We think if there's an independent panel, it's far more likely that those ideas are going to be taken seriously. We think it's far less likely that people are only going to engage with it's unfeasible, it's unfeasible, it's unfeasible. Because people actually know that it's already approved, which means we no longer have to look at whether it's feasible or not, but look at the consequences of it, right? Look at the fact that we're willing to sacrifice one group for another group. We have to look at the fact what we think about the long term versus the short term. Those are decisions you can only make if you move on from the idea whether it's feasible or not. We think that those value decisions are far more likely to be discussed under our side of the house if we no longer have to have the my expert is better than your expert discussion. But what happens even more so, right? We think that currently you can lie because you can always pay someone to back you up. Perhaps economics are people who care a lot about money and therefore they're willing to say whatever you want them to say. But we think in general people can lie because they can always find someone who actually agrees with them. We think that experts are already part of the conversation. Experts are already claimed to your side. The difference is we have independent experts who aren't paid by political parties and are therefore far more likely to have real opinions and have opinions that they actually believe in and that are true. Please sit down. Moving on to faith in politicians and what it actually does to the collective action problem. We tell you that if you say, I want to create lots of roads, build a huge wall, those are things that sound super, super sexy, right? Those are things where you can say, I'm going to change the nation. I'm going to do great things for you. It's not as sexy when you say, well, it's kind of expensive. We think that might be rather problematic, right? We think those are messages that are far harder to get across. Those are negative messages that are far more difficult to persuade people of voting for you. If one political party says, I'm going to improve everything, you're going to get so much money, you don't know what to do with it, and the other political party says it's going to be really, really tough, please sit down, coming 4 years, we think that means that political party is not going to get votes. What does that mean for the political discourse and for how political parties behave? We think lots of political parties currently claim things that are untrue because they have to outsmart the other party, because they have to say things that are even better and even better. We think that means there's a pattern of lying across the lines of political parties. I'll take CD.
So,
CO.
complex is something that also defines immigrants and security policies. Do we believe that other than consistency, we should have these panels for all policies?
So I don't necessarily think we have to defend that it's only for economic policies. We think specifically economic policies have the gaps of knowledge that Floris talks about. We think that that is something we can make decisions about. Also, we think specifically economic policies have the problem of collective action problems where many people lie. What are the impacts? 2. First, we say, as a government, we use incentives for breaking collective action problems all the time. You get, a fine if you don't pay your taxes, because that's a collective action problem we want to break. But secondly, we think if politicians constantly lie to you, constantly say things that they'll never make up, that means you lose trust within the system. One last part. They tell you we can no longer care about minorities. That's untrue under any circumstances. You know what's unviable economic policy to say immigrants cannot enter your country. To a certain extent, I'm unsure why economic policy wouldn't allow for immigrants. We actually think there are huge economic benefits to them. So we actually think that's also something that would happen more in our side of the house. Ladies and gentlemen, we think policies and governance should be about the truth. Please propose.
Should I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the case?
clearly not in this debate. Most of OG's case. Everything that has to say about how great it would be if we had an independent panel who could criticize government decisions. Great, let's have that. All of the damages that we point to are when this independent panel has the ability to override government decisions. This is what they have to defend, this is what they have not done, and this is why they're in a real problem in this debate. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going in more about, I get to talk about Nordhaus business cycle, which is so exciting as a PPE student, which means I'm going to talk about how the spending cycle of politicians actually work, expanding on what Eitan already told us, but before that I have to go into a few pieces of refutation. So first of all, we get the idea about accountability. And they say, look, these people are just much less likely to make mistakes, so they don't really need accountability to begin with. This isn't what accountability is, right? Accountability is, when I make a mistake, I have a power to come and punish you for making that mistake, right? When a politician comes and does something which has harmed me, right? And maybe I don't understand completely what exactly the economic policy was that harmed me, but I now know that I have no job, then I can go and vote him out of power and vote someone else in instead. The shift of this debate happens when that politician now says, oh, it wasn't actually my fault, it was these guys' fault over here. Notice A, this means that it's less likely they're going to vote the politician out of power, but B, the people who have made the mistakes continue making those mistakes because they remain in the panel and they have no ability of the public to impact their decision despite the fact that they control the lives of the public. And this right here is a principled problem that we simply do not think that governments, no thank you, can win this debate without addressing. Secondly, we say here, they talk to us about how there will be a majority of perspectives on the different things because of the academy. And because essentially inside the academy we have many voices that do talk about left-wing policies. A, notice how this doesn't engage with anything that Eitan tells you about, how these individual people inside the academy who are inside this board and the people who are going forward in life want to have greater financial wealth, want to be in greater financial institutions, still have the incentive to not go towards the more left-wing policies. We're not saying here there aren't going to be any left-wing people on the panel. We're going to see they're going to be greatly outweighed by the prevalent theories, also inside economic theory, also inside academia today, and also inside all the institutions that feed into this, which is the neoliberalism, which means that we won't get these policies. And when they say, look, but if the left wing just isn't feasible, it depends on what you're measuring, right? That already begs the question. If the economy is only supposed to be about essentially what it is that makes the most financial sense, right? That's buying into the neoliberal sense. What we can say is that the economy is also supposed to be something which brings us together. We're supposed to invest, no thank you, inside the poorer areas because we have a moral responsibility to them, even though it might harm the overall economy of everyone inside society. We might make less money overall, right? But poorer people will have more. That's a moral judgment that governments and people get to decide, not independent panels. Now, moving on to the issue of this independent panel, and they say how it's going to be taken so seriously, right? And then they say it's going to be taken so seriously, and this will lead to an amazing discourse. So here, first of all, notice, and I'm getting this later into my speech, but that the right wing, right, like the right wing people who don't trust the elite, right? What was it that was said in the Brexit? We've had enough of experts, right? We've had enough of these people coming in and telling us what we want to do. The right-wing rhetoric, which is currently being prevalent, the populist rhetoric, is saying, don't trust the people in the ivory tower. Don't trust any of them. Don't trust the establishment. Only trust us. When they're saying that the people that they're supposed to be holding accountable for, the people that supposedly everyone is supposed to trust, aren't the people that the people trust, they're in a serious problem. I'll take opening.
Focusing on minorities is still a valid economic decision. The problem lies where you don't have the money to actually invest in those minorities. That's the only thing that panel will have opinions about.
So if they're literally saying the panel will only have the ability, like, what does that mean, not have the money, right? I am a government. I have huge amounts of money, right? It's where I take one set of money and invest it from somewhere else. So I'm going to take it from security and divert that money into a different place, right? That is no, thank you. Those are the kind of decisions that the government should make. The government with an overarching approach, not just what's the most economically sound decision, but also what's the best societal decision as well. Finally, let's talk about Nordhaus. Okay, so what do we say here? When we campaign, right, as politicians, we campaign on two things. A, we campaign on the promises that we're going to make, which are apparently going to be limited under this side of the house. but 2, on the past actions that I've already taken. Now, politicians, they admit, are people who want to be re-elected. They want to be seen as someone who is helping the people, who is spending money on the people. And what does this lead to? It means that before election time, politicians start spending huge amounts of money on money. Now, this isn't campaign promises. They just start with tax cuts. They start spending in schools. They start spending on all the kind of things that look popular and look very pretty. What happens here is that what this means is this plan A doesn't stop the irresponsible spending that they claim they want to stop, right? Because that's how it happens independent of the campaign promises. Many of the campaign promises, as everyone admits, don't actually materialize. What does materialize, however, is all the net harms that they talk about popular spending. 2, we say that it actually increases under this plan. Why? Because if I can no longer make a promise, right, I am stopped from making promises about what I can do. The only thing I can do to point about why you should elect me is because of my past actions. It's because of the amount of money that I spend. This means that people in power have a greater incentive to spend more money, even though it might be harmful in the long term, and they know it will be harmful in the long term, because at the end of the day, this means that they can be re-elected. 3, this also notices that it makes it much more difficult for opposition parties to actually come and be elected. Why? Because they can't make the fantastical promises that they're talking about. However, the people inside the government can still say, look, we gave you such huge tax breaks, we gave you all these amazing things, we're not promising you anything amazing, but look at the great stuff we've done, opposition hasn't done any of that. And finally, the kind of people who the censure, so what have we got here today? We've said to you quite simply that we have a principal problem with the accountability of putting people in charge of such an important issue. If they want to increase that to security and everything else, then we have a principal problem with basically disfranchising the entire government and leaving it up to experts to make their decision. 2, we say that there is not enough varied amount of perspective on what it is that economical decisions that need to be made inside society, and this is a government decision and a people decision, and not purely an economic decision on how we make the most efficient things. And finally, we say that all they do is actually increase the amount of spending and the popular spending that happens in society by removing the tool of people to make promises and leaving them only the tool to spend as much as possible. They create the very harm they set out to solve. We beg you to oppose.
When British parliamentary candidate Phil Woollers said to constituents during the 2015 general election that his opponent was supported by terrorist groups, that was a lie. And an unelected body, who was the Electoral Commission in the United Kingdom, ruled him out of order and said that that election was void because he defrauded the public and in the process distorted the democratic process. That is what we will bring in from closing government, that there is an analogy here between other kinds of non-democratic checks that we have on a democratic process that stops distortion. Because whilst opening government wanted to talk about outright lies, the problem is much more pervasive than that. Because we're going to claim that there are structural democratic incentives that without this particular intervention will always pervade and will always lead to distortionary effects. Note, however, from the outset that despite the accusations of opening opposition, this is not the outsourcing of policy to an unelected body, although we'd be happy to defend that because we asked them first of all the question as to would they object to the outsourcing of monetary policy to independent central banks. I would suggest that that decision has led to stability since we decided to do that because it led to Democrats not being able to play with interest rates and lead to hyperinflation. But look, What this really is allowing experts to vet the veracity of policies before they are presented to an electorate, and then the democratic process allows you to adjudicate reasonable conceptions of the good. 2 points from close to government. 1, democratic failure and why there will always be an incentive to distort the truth. Secondly, why, contrary to opening opposition, the cutting out of the left wing is not a problem created by this issue, it is a status quo one, while we will correct the influence of big business and how it also distorts democracy. A few outstanding points of rebuttal. They said that their fudge in this debate over the opposition was to say that it's fine because we support a panel to criticise after the fact. But then I love this because later in their speech they also said, but wasn't it funny in the Brexit campaign when everyone said they don't like experts anymore? Like, that is precisely the problem, that once the policy is out in public, the critique is much less effective. That you're in a political domain where the critique is not as powerful. So we say, you must filter the policy before it enters the public domain so you can have that debate. So that fudge did not work. Then they talked about how you could not justify taking on debt. No, you can justify it if there is a justification. I'm quite sure this panel would have approved the Trouble Asset Relief Programme because the justification was given that it would save businesses and banks from, and would save the American economy from a huge recession. I'm also quite confident that they would have approved the New Deal or post-World War II spending by the Labour government because it also had a clear economic plan for growth and jobs. No thanks. I don't know what you're banging the table for. Let's talk about democratic failure now. Opening government talked about outright lies. As I said, the problem is much more pervasive than that. We'll explain why democracy has structural incentives that mean lies and distortions will always occur without this policy intervention. Why does this claim matter? Because democracy requires a level as playing field as possible for voters to be able to adjudicate reasonable conceptions of the good. That's why we ban racist parties, because they are not a reasonable conception of that good. Without that correction, there is democratic failure and democracy is distorted. Here's the analogy. As I flagged in my opening, we already rule out politicians who tell outright lies and slander other candidates in elections. That was the instance of Phil Woollers. So why is this an instance of defrauding the public in an analogous fashion? I want to say 3 things here in addition to opening government. 1, there's a structural incentive to oversimplify, which leads to distortions and lies. In a democracy, to get elected, there is a requirement that you appeal to a large, homogenised base to be able to capture a centre ground to win. This means there's an incentive to simplify, which leads to often lying. That's why politicians have been able to spin the lie that the budget is somehow equivalent to balancing a chequebook. And people say, oh, why can't the government just balance their budget? I can balance my chequebook. Or more pervasively, they made government spending akin to spending on a credit card. And politicians like Conservatives can say, no, we just need to justify austerity because you overspent on the credit card, on the national government's credit card. Appealing to those kind of simplifications is a distortion and a lie. It is precisely these commissions that would stop that happening. They would say, no, that is a false analogy because governments are able to, for example, borrow at much lesser rates. They get collateral, they also have central banks and control over the money supply, so there's never a chance that they would default. They'd stop them making those claims. The problem is that that's a distortion of the status quo that we are correcting. That voters are able to better adjudicate those conceptions of the good. No thanks. Secondly, false causation. The complexity of economic policy and the concurrent need to sell policy to publics means that you can attribute cause to outcome when it is not the case. That's why the Tories were able to justify an austerity platform policy by saying that they needed to check Labour spending that caused the crash in 2008. But of course that was a lie because it was not a government spending problem, it was a banking crisis. This stops it. The consequence is you get better policy deliberation because now Tory and Labour have to have a discussion about what you do in response to the actual problem, that being poor regulation of a banking sector. Thirdly, short-termism. Under the status quo, no thanks. All economists agree, left or right, that long-run policies and reform are important, like the supply side. But that's a tension with the democratic requirement to be short-termist, to fulfil voters' needs now to win the next election. That means that you will say things are long when they are, in fact, not. So you will say that I'm doing something now, like cutting tax, and in the long run that will lead to reform, but in fact, that is also a lie. That's how, the problem with this, that's how, no thanks, crisis breeds, because you don't get the kind of reform that we need. We fix that because now you cannot attribute those 2 things together. You cannot conflate them. So now there's a better incentive to be long-termist. That means you're more likely to get structural reform investment, which is needed to fix the economy. Second argument, big business and right-wingers, but before that, opening. Please, no, you have to look at me. I can't hear.
Right. You tell us status quo is very bad without actually engaging with any of our material on why all of
Yeah, and the reason I've not done that is because I'm doing it now. Opening opposition's big claim is that this shut out the left. Yes, obviously we can balance the panel. Krugman and Stiglitz exist. But I think opening government have already dealt with the chunk of this. But the more important problem is that it misdiagnoses the problem. The left at the moment is already being shut out of the conversation by a formidable force of money and big business. It is our claim that in the same way that huge campaign finance is also distortionary of democracy, and therefore we check that by restricting the amount of money you can spend in an election, that this power, the businesses command, is also a distortion. How does this happen? When progressive policy is often proposed, whether that be things like higher taxes, minimum wage increases, or cracking down on monopolies, businesses will often make exaggerated threats to try and avoid having to incur the cost of those policies. For example, they'll say that we'll leave the country or that we'll cut jobs as a consequence. These policies are often exaggerated because they have an incentive to avoid having to take on that cost at all, and there's no reason why they wouldn't do it. They will say in response to this, no, that's not a policy. But here's the thing. What parties do is that when you ideologically align, they will co-opt what they say and use it as part of their policy platform. So when businesses said that they would leave if Labour won the general election in 2010, the Tories then made it policy to oppose anything that Labour was doing and use that as the justification for that policy. That means that businesses are able to monopolise policy creation because it's able to exaggerate and distort truth to leverage those demands. This means that they have a stranglehold on policy that exists. So it's not the problem that we don't listen to Krugman enough, it's that we let big business distort what we think about democratic choice. On our side, we fix that problem because now we make it much harder for people to be able to distort the truth in that way. In the same way that we stop distortions of democracy through campaign finance, we should also stop big business being able to exaggerate and distort truth and then letting politicians incorporate that into their policy platform. So voters can better adjudicate that conception of the good without being falsely scared into voting for something that is not true. We intervene in democracy in undemocratic ways all the time to make it work better. It's never been made clear to us why this is not just another super-duper example of why we should do it. Propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech, and I warmly call on the member of opposition on behalf of Tel Aviv.
Dear panel, we believe what we need in this point is to ground the debate and to look at how this policy is likely to play out in the sort of discourse it creates, what parties are likely to publish after this is done, and we're going to show you that even if we accept all the damages for discourse that governments have provided so far, they only become significantly worse and more populistic on their side of the house. I'm going to do this firstly, so looking at why we get more populism and less information to the public. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the disparity between small and big parties and why small parties are harmed significantly worse by this policy. Before that, a few extraneous points of rebuttal. First, note the majority of the previous speaker's speech is outside of this debate by the definition of opening government. Opening government said, we're asking a binary question whether this policy is feasible or not. CG want to talk in this debate about whether austerity is the right way to deal with the banking crisis. This is not in the debate by the definition. The question of what is good or bad economic policy they said themselves is not what they're adjudicating. Secondly, note that given that this is a binary question, OG's logic on why this is such a complex decision also falls out of this debate. Why? Because all the Commission needs to do on their side of the house is simply say, we have reviewed this is not a feasible policy. All the benefits they want still occur just by that. And if they tell us, but people won't believe this committee, we're saying that becomes significantly worse when that committee is able to sanction what politicians have to say, and I'm going to touch on this in my first point. Next, they tell us, look, advancing, they talk to us about why it's illegitimate and it's a lie to sell a policy that won't work. What we say is, when you say a policy that doesn't work, or we don't have enough money to do, what you actually mean is, it will force us to take more loans, it will force us to increase our national deficit. We say that is a legitimate decision for governments to make. That is a legitimate decision because it is a decision on the level of risk we're willing to incur upon our society in order to fulfill certain societal benefits. We're saying this is exactly the sort of situation in which we say the public is the one that should be able to make the decision whether we prioritize short-term over long-term under current status quo. We're saying that governments make decisions on risk-taking all the time, and this is exactly the same here. Let's talk about about populism and less information. Because, note, the purpose of governments in this debate is to get a more informed public and more accountability of parties. First of all, we dispute the characterization by OG and to a certain extent CG, saying that large parties promise unrealistic things constantly. We say that it's untrue for several reasons. First of all, note that these are usually the parties who have been in power before, meaning the public has seen exactly what they're able to do, and they want to resound exactly those messages. Meaning they say if they promise every time something that is indeliverable, just as OG themselves have told us, they are not likely to be voted in again, and we're saying that in itself is an incentive not to do it. Secondly, they usually do have serious economic plans. Like it's not that hard to come up with a serious economic plan for on how to advance the economy. Moreover, they don't want to be seen as unserious and to have the discourse of criticism against them when they do this, when they make promises that are completely unfulfillable. What do we allow them to do now, however? We allow them, on the one hand, to say we have had a wonderful policy, a policy that would have solved all our problems. We will now not be able to implement. Why would we not be able to implement it? Because a panel of experts had said that this is not something we can do. Why is this critical? Because what this means factually is, while they don't define punishment for leaking this sort of information, we say it is likely to still be out there. By things like super PACs, by things like people who are close to Donald Trump saying, oh, I think Donald Trump, if he had the ability, and experts will not have blocked him, would have had this policy implemented. This is the sort of things that are likely to happen on a constant basis. So we get significantly more parties, get significantly less information from parties beforehand on what their economic policies are. Note, if the OG tell us that it's much sexier to promise grand things than to talk about trade-offs. If that is true, when one large party implements this mechanism, like makes grand promises and says that experts have blocked them, the other party has to engage in that as well because it's more appealing to voters. Meaning you get a race to the bottom here where you get significantly less information coming out to the public. So yes, we get first of all less economic promises being thrown out in the first place. We get less information on economic policy, and we get more radicalization of discourse, saying we could have done wonderful things, and less understanding, less willingness by politicians themselves to communicate the problems with certain policies. Because note, today, when a government wants to justify why it hasn't done something, when a party wants to justify why it's not doing something, it will have to tell the public, look, economics is a complex issue in which you have trade-offs. Now, they simply can avoid saying that by just saying, look, we could have solved the problem to the best extent possible. These people are stopping us from doing that. So we get significantly less information and less accountability to voters on their side of the house. Before I go on, opening.
Do you think a panel of highly knowledgeable experts think we have an unfeasible economic policy is a good political strategy?
We say you can get that on your side of the house by just having them criticize the policy. On our side of the house, what you can have, especially if you are a party that appeals to populist rhetoric, you can, or just by the fact that this policy has now been implemented, right? Before that, we've had our serious, we've been a party that you know is serious and you know is responsible. Now someone blocked us, and this is exactly the narrative we're able to portray to our voters. Let's talk about the disparity between small and big parties. First of all, note the sanctions are different. The sanctions, if they apply as financial and so on, are significantly larger on smaller parties because they have less budget. But moreover, if I'm a small party that represents a certain sector of society, what I need as an economic plan is specifically to say what my sector is going to gain. Because otherwise, I won't have the ability to communicate intensity of preferences and say in coalition and negotiations, for example, this is the only thing I'm going to focus on. This is the only thing that's going to be there. That is not a sound economic plan. That is not an economic plan that can be sustained because you're not addressing the general economy. But this is their platform, and this is the appeal of that platform, first of all, to their voters. And this is a necessary part of their platform because otherwise, if they do give a responsible platform, including all societal issues, they're less appealing to their own voters, and they're less able to, in parliamentary negotiations, to say this is a single issue that we care about. So we make them significantly worse off. For all these reasons, we get less discourse, we get a worse political process. We're extremely proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
to talk about 3 points of fact in this debate. Firstly, I want to clear up some of the gross mischaracterizations about both how this panel is going to operate and how this panel is going to be perceived that have been peddled by both opposition teams. Next, I want to talk about long-run economic decisions, about why it's Josh who explains that the status quo leads to chronic underinvestment, leads to chronic lack of public understanding about economic problems, and why we, from closing government, win that clash. Finally, I want to briefly touch over the points we made about checking the power of unaccountable elites, particularly big business, that the opposition extension chose not to respond to. Before I get into that, I want to just have one extraneous bit of rebuttal, and it's to this weird counterprop we're getting out of opposition, where they say, guys, we should just have a body made up of experts which criticises the policies of political parties, which says that they're wrong. Note, if they do implement that, their complaints that our panel leads to left-wing economists being shut out, they are irrelevant, because that happens on both sides of the House, so that point is out of the debate. Note also that their complaints about how this is likely to stoke anti-elite sentiment, that is also out of the debate, because people don't like the fact that there's a panel of experts, even if their analysis was effectively based around a Michael Gove quote, right? So they are stabbing a lot of their own analysis when they talk about this counterprop. If they run away from that, they can see that we have no way of realistically checking the pledges made by politicians. But look, let's say it's set up, and let's say those knives don't exist. Here's what the comparative in this debate looks like, right? The comparative on their side of the House is that politicians distort the truth and overclaim, right? They simplify facts and try to mislead the public in the ways that Josh told you, and those policies are out there, and so they do receive some criticism, right? But by the time that criticism is levelled at those policies, a large number of them are kind of sunk into voters' minds, voters who are maybe not hugely politically engaged, and so they think there's some truth to the policies, and so all the problems about democratic distortion that Josh told you about happen. That's why we felt that was a silly counterprop for them to have taken. Let's talk about how this panel is going to work. About how this panel is going to operate. The first thing I want to do is deal with opening opposition's claim that the left is going to be systematically shut out of politics. Before I do, note a lot of their analysis is based around neoliberal being a synonym for bad. At no point does anyone on the yacht bench say why we as judges should think neoliberalism is bad. One line of analysis, neoliberalism means more economic growth which benefits everyone. I've done more analysis about why that might actually be beneficial in terms of why the left is not going to be shut out. Look, many academic economists are just left-wing. We know that's factually true. Structural reasons why. Banks don't control promotions of academic economists. That was a lie. 2, academics have tenure, so it was nonsense to say that they're dependent on being really, really right-wing. 3rd, academics are frequently unionised. Because they don't earn a lot of money as academics, they tend to be more left-wing because they tend to be highly educated. They are often quite left-wing. 4, because they have a left-wing audience where they sell their books, like Paul Krugman does, or all the other people Josh talked about. Finally, note that Josh talked in his big business point about how we actually benefit left-wing economic discourse because we stop the power of big business to make lies, for instance, about the minimum wage. Got no response. No. Next bit on the panel is their criticism that this is going to lead to an upswing. Oh no, the next bit on the panel is the attack we got from the op extension that Josh's material was out of debate because opening government set this debate up as a kind of binary question, and Josh was talking about complex economic issues. The reason that that's like an absurd attack is that the examples that Josh gives you, right, is the Tory party making simplistic claims, like saying it was because Labour expanded the state in the 2000s that Britain now has an economic crash. Therefore, if we just shrink the state, the economic problems will go away. That is a binary question. That is also a question of economic policy. So it is in this debate. In terms of populism, then, they claim that these panels are going to lead to mass big problems because populist rhetoric will attack experts. This was the claim we got out of the DLO. Again, I think a lot of the analysis was basically based around one Michael Gove quote. Michael Gove said we've had enough of experts and leave one. Those things are not causally related. In terms of more sophisticated rebuttal, we say that actually independent groups are broadly trusted by voters, right? So this panel is likely to be trusted in the same way that levels of public confidence in the judiciary, in the monetary policy committees of Western liberal democracies are trusted more. Why? Because voters tend tend to think that politicians are self-serving, whereas people employed by the state tend to be more benevolent and more trustworthy. CEO added a couple of marginal lines to this when they said, well, what's going to happen is parties are going to have their policies vetoed, and they're going to say, oh, no, guys, it was vetoed, it's a really, really great policy. We don't think that's feasible. Why? Because voters value economic credibility. If a party says, you should vote for me because I will implement economic policies, which a large body of experts said were unfeasible, right? We think that those parties have no credibility, and most voters will reject them. Moreover, we suggest that there will be a general political desire to coalesce around facts. In terms of why we don't think parties will accept the judgment of the panel when they're fighting elections and then change policies when they get into government, all of Josh's analysis about why this incentivises beneficial things like justifying long-term investment as good. Finally, no response to the fact that we do, under the status quo, impose limits on what politicians can say. For instance, the fact that the dismissal of Phil Wallace for trying to defraud his electorate was widely supported by all parties because they want general standards of decency, because we say politicians do have some degree of public service. Closing.
If, as you say, voters really care about what experts have to say about economic criticism, there is no problem on your side of the house. If voters don't care about this,
I'm sorry, I've dealt with this earlier. Voters often don't hear the criticism of economic experts. So, during the Brexit debate, the UK Statistics Authority said the Brexit campaign was making misleading facts, but it just didn't have the power to stop those facts being plastered over a bus and misleading people. That's why we win. Let's talk about long-term investment and the complications of the economy. OG are correct that it is bad if a party lies and says we can find £500 billion and it'll be great. I think Josh's analysis about how parties frequently misattribute the cause of economic problems and therefore the required solutions is more important, because that's frequently what happens. Voters don't understand that, for instance, long-term investment or long-term economic reforms take years to effect, take years to come into place, and they might provide benefit to the economy, even if, for instance, a natural resource shock means the overall economy goes into reverse. This means we have more sensible economic policy which benefits people in a real, clear way, because it generates jobs, because it makes the economy more beneficial for them. It allows them to gain economically. It allows them to have services which are more beneficial. I'm incredibly proud to propose this motion, which gives power to people to make the decisions that they want. Vote wrong.
I stand to speak for their fine speech, and I warmly call upon the up went.
I have policies, I have the best economic policies. Experts made me lie, believe me, hashtag crooked Hillary. This is a policy, Mr. Speaker. And in the policy debate, we have to ask ourselves what the policy, specifically tied with the mechanism set by opening government, actually does in the real world. We don't have to ask ourselves what is the optimistic way that closing government actually wants to achieve, but rather what is going to happen. Two simple questions in this summation. Firstly, where is the impact of this specific policy and how is it going to be distributed? Secondly, the backlash of this policy, specifically compared to what we already get from the deputy leader of the opposition that is supporting the independent body criticizing the government, but rather not having the power to overrule it. Let's start. What is the impact? Opening government gives you the following case. Complex knowledge is missing. Closing government tell you about, but discussion is something that you should aspire to. DLO tell you the following. Independent body to review it, but not to publish and override it. Here is a link that I'm going to close for them right now to show why it destroys open government. Because, no, when we ask them in a POI, the following. Do you believe that we should also enforce it post the elections? They say no, because calling out an individual is enough. I'm actually quoting the Prime Minister in this debate. If this is correct, that calling out is enough, then the independent body is enough criticizing and saying this policy is a sham, rather than actually having the power to make and hide it. Here is what we get from CG on that. They tell you, but listen, this is something that actually pushes most of the material of opposition outside of the debate. The principle, accountability, oppositions, left-wing policies, the discussion that is going to happen is going to be the same on both sides of the House. In a minute I'm going to tell you exactly why our extension is something that does not happen only within the differentiation between the two if we accept what was said by open opposition themselves. But then we get discourse is something that we care about. Here is a couple of reasons in which we get all that they want, all the harms are actually going to be after the policy as well. A, you have no one to force them to implement it after the election. Secondly, note, the entire idea of right now, we just don't have economists who are going to be able to go and criticize these policies and create a discourse. When was the last time that you have met someone in the UK that is studying economics in Cambridge or Oxford and every other university who is willing to shut up after Brexit? We simply don't accept the world. They simply cannot just go on TV and criticize and create a discourse that they want. On both sides of the House, this is going to happen. Moreover, as said in the extension, and was not rebuttal, really is not rebuttal at all, most of the discourse is already created by things as super PACs. 75 of the money comes from there. There is no one that is going to be able to stop people from leaking it online and creating the discourse for them. On both worlds, this policy does nothing in order to make sure that we're going to be able to stop the damn lies that both open government and closing government wants us to achieve. This is something that I created. The discourse is imaginary because we're never going to get there. But what is going to change it? Here is an extension in this debate. The following. Note, right now, the value of transparency is going to disappear. Because right now, there was a demand in Donald Trump to actually publish an economic policy. He has done it. Under our world, under the world of the government, he has the following excuse. I have an economic policy, but they're not allowing me to publish it. Because if they want to have the discourse of the independent body that can actually have the capacity to tell you not to publish something, this is exactly what is going to disappear. The discourse of actually making the accountability to the public that is going to be created is now going to create a fabricated excuse in order to prevent specifically that. But we don't also stop there. We have a second part of the extension that was unresponded to. Right now, many people, even if they are Donald Trump, they have published some sort of an economic plan. You can call it bad, but it is out there and can be criticized. Not something that cannot happen if it actually doesn't publish anything on it. Most centrist parties actually have the incentive to publish it right now. However, now there's a clear incentive to remove these parts as well and give it without context, even for the centrist parties. Because there is more of a chance that they're going to be heavily criticized and blocked if you accept the logic coming from governments themselves in this way. Because they're not going to be related to the idea of saying that they have something which is not sound enough to actually be blocked from publishing to the greater public. Which means that if we have the context now, once this policy is passed, all I have to do is to tell you I'm going to build a wall, which is unfortunately is a feasible policy because the United States has $20 billion, it has much more, however, without any context of where we're going to remove it from, because you can't demand them to publish exactly these things. Closing.
Yeah, but the thing is, Trump has published an economic policy, which says that if he deports Mexicans, there will be mass employment in the United States.
This policy, okay. First of all, if you're not going to employ this policy to other fields as open government, specifically in API, say that they're not willing to defend that because this is something completely different, you're just simply not accepting the fact that he's not going to be able to publish the fact that he's going to deport Mexicans. Note moreover, he's still going to be able to leak it and to be able to say this is something that they have done, and this is a sunk damage, right? Because people are going to be able to do exactly the same here. Now, he can just say, I am going to remove Mexicans from our country without giving the economic context of what is going to happen as a result to the economy of the United States. You're achieving nothing with your motion. But we even go deeper to another part that was not responded by the closing government. We said the following. There is an asymmetry in the abuse in this debate. How come? We give the following clarification already to the Prime Minister. We asked, what is going to be the result if I'm going to be caught lying as this policy, right? Assumingly, you must need a strong deterrent. Otherwise, it's another reason why this policy does nothing. Because if you're not going to fine anyone, they're still going to do exactly the same. As said, in our extension, abuse is something which is asymmetrical. Because if I'm a small party, I don't have the same resources, the same lawyers to defend my policies as the bigger parties. This causes a lot of distress within the political system towards actually parties which are stronger that can handle it. But on a deeper level, this is perfectly sound for the smallest parties to cater only for their own needs. Note, all of the democracies over the West actually allow it. A, by the fact that they can actually prioritize their constituencies by implementing their policies, and B, by the mere fact that in most European democracies we have parties which only cater for specific minorities. If now you actually believe government side that we're going to be able to force them to create discussion of tidy economic plans, we're forcing them to actually cater for the greater good of the public. Because it's okay for them to tell you, I'm going to massively prioritize it at the expense of every other party in order to be able to cater inside the policies so that the electorate is going to actually select them for parliament. This is a huge damage in this debate because these are parties that represent the weakest part of our societies. Note, we have given you the differentiation of what this policy actually does. This is the real world policy, and this is what you should ask yourself while judging this debate. You must oppose this policy.